The rain hammered against my apartment window in downtown Seattle as I stared at the eviction notice in my trembling hands. 3 days. That's all I had left before losing the small restaurant that had been my life for the past 8 years. My name is Miguel Santos and I'm 34 years old. What started as a food truck serving authentic Mexican cuisine to construction workers had grown into Santos Kitchen, a modest but beloved restaurant in the Pike Place Market area. The lunch rush was always packed with office workers craving my grandmother's recipes, and weekend evenings brought families celebrating birthdays and anniversaries. But now, everything was falling apart. The notice came from Blackstone Properties, the massive real estate corporation that had bought our building 6 months ago. They wanted to demolish it for a luxury condo development, and I was the last tenant refusing to leave. "Miguel, you need to see this," called Rosa, my kitchen manager and closest friend, holding up her phone. Her usually cheerful face was pale with worry. Rosa had been with me since the beginning, a single mother of 2 who'd worked her way up from dishwasher to running my entire kitchen operation. The news article on her screen made my stomach drop. Local restaurant owner refuses $1 million buyout, faces legal action. The comments below were brutal. Greedy small business owner holding up progress. Just take the money and run. He's going to lose everything anyway. What they didn't understand was that this wasn't about money. This building wasn't just brick and mortar to me, it was where I'd built something meaningful. Where Mrs. Patterson came every Tuesday for lunch after her chemotherapy appointments because my pozole reminded her of better days. Where Tommy, the homeless veteran, knew he could always count on a warm meal even when he couldn't pay. The buyout offer from Blackstone was substantial, $2.3 million for my business and lease rights. Most people would have taken it and run. But I'd seen what happened to other small businesses in the neighborhood. They took the money, moved to cheaper areas, and slowly died as their customer base disappeared. I wasn't ready to give up. My lawyer, Janet Morrison, had been honest from the beginning. "Miguel, they have deep pockets and political connections. Fighting Blackstone Properties is like David versus Goliath. Except Goliath has a team of Harvard-educated attorneys and unlimited resources." Janet was a solo practitioner who specialized in small business law. She drove a 10-year-old Honda and worked out of a cramped office above a dry cleaner. She wasn't flashy, but she really cared about her clients. When I couldn't afford her full retainer up front, she agreed to a payment plan because she believed in the case. "But here's the thing," she had continued, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses as she reviewed my lease agreement. "Your grandfather signed this lease in 1987, and there's some very specific language about property development that might work in our favor. It's a long shot, but it's something." That something was a clause requiring the property owner to provide alternative commercial space of equal value within a 5-mile radius if they terminated the lease for development purposes. It seemed like a standard protection, but Blackstone's lawyers apparently missed it when they structured their buyout strategy. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was my mother calling from Phoenix, where she'd moved after my father passed away 3 years ago. "Mijo, I saw the news online. Are you sure about this fight? Maybe it's time to come home, help me with the flower shop here." Her voice carried the weight of a mother's worry. She'd watched my father struggle with his own small business, a auto repair shop, for 30 years before it finally succeeded. She knew the cost of fighting big corporations. "Mama, this is my home now. Santos Kitchen isn't just a business, it's our family legacy. Abuela's recipes, Papa's work ethic, everything we've built is here." After hanging up, I walked through my empty restaurant. It was past closing time and the dining room felt eerily quiet. The walls were covered with photos of customers celebrating milestones, newspaper clippings about community events we'd catered, and thank you cards from local schools we'd supported. Rosa emerged from the kitchen, having finished cleaning for the night. "Miguel, I need to tell you something. My sister called today. She heard Blackstone is offering jobs to any of our employees who want to transfer to their hotel restaurant downtown. Good pay, benefits, steady hours." My heart sank. I couldn't blame my staff for considering other options. Most of them had families to support, and the uncertainty of our legal battle was taking its toll on everyone. "Are you thinking about it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She shook her head firmly. "I'm with you until the end, but I'm worried about the others. Carlos got another offer from that new chain restaurant on Capitol Hill. Linda's husband is pressuring her to find something more stable. Carlos was my sous chef, a talented young cook who'd come from El Salvador 2 years ago. He sent most of his paycheck to his family back home and couldn't afford to be unemployed. Linda worked our front counter and had been with us for 4 years, reliable, friendly, and beloved by our regular customers. That night, I stayed late going over our finances with my accountant, Jerry Walsh. Jerry was a numbers guy in his 60s who'd helped dozens of small businesses in the area navigate tough times. His office was a maze of client files and coffee-stained calculators, but his advice was always solid. Miguel, I'm going to be straight with you. Between legal fees and the revenue you're losing from all this negative publicity, you've got maybe 2 months of operating capital left. This case drags on. It won't, I interrupted, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Janet thinks we can get a quick resolution if the judge sees the merit in our lease clause argument. Jerry leaned back in his creaky chair. And if you're wrong? If this Blackstone Corporation decides to make an example out of you? The question hung in the air as I drove home through the dark Seattle streets. Rain continued to fall, and the city lights blurred through my windshield like watercolors. I thought about all the small businesses that had closed in our neighborhood over the past few years, family-owned shops replaced by corporate chains, authentic character replaced by sanitized uniformity. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Mr. Santos, this is Richard Blackwood from Blackstone Properties. We should talk before this gets out of hand. Our offer stands, but not for much longer. I deleted the message without responding. Some fights were worth having even when the odds were stacked against you. As I pulled into my apartment complex, I noticed a black sedan parked across the street with its engine running. When I looked back after getting out of my car, it was gone. Probably nothing, but the stress was making me paranoid about everything. My apartment felt empty and cold. I lived alone, having ended a long-term relationship 2 years ago when Anna decided she wanted something more stable than dating a restaurant owner who worked 70-hour weeks. She wasn't wrong, the business consumed most of my time and energy. But it was also my passion, my purpose, my connection to everything my family had taught me about hard work and serving others. I made myself a simple dinner and sat at my small kitchen table, looking out at the Seattle skyline. Somewhere in one of those gleaming office towers, Blackstone executives were probably planning their next move against me. They had resources I couldn't imagine, teams of lawyers, political connections, enough money to outlast me in any prolonged legal battle. But they didn't have what I had: a legitimate legal argument, a community that supported me, and the kind of stubborn determination that comes from knowing you're fighting for something bigger than yourself. The eviction notice sat on my counter, still damp from the rain. 3 days to respond, Janet had said. 3 days to decide whether to fight or surrender everything I'd worked for. I picked up my phone and called her. Janet, it's Miguel. I know it's late, but I need to know, do we really have a chance? Her voice was tired but firm. Miguel, I've been practicing law for 15 years, and I've never seen a more clear-cut case of lease violation. The language in your grandfather's contract is ironclad. The question isn't whether we'll win, it's whether we can survive long enough to get to trial. Then let's file our response tomorrow. I'm not backing down. After hanging up, I felt a strange sense of peace. The decision was made. Win or lose, I would fight for Santos Kitchen, for my employees, for the community we'd built together. Some things were worth risking everything for. I spent the rest of the evening writing emails to my staff, my suppliers, and my most loyal customers, explaining the situation and asking for their support. If Blackstone wanted a fight, they were going to get one. But they were also going to discover that sometimes the little guy has more fight in him than they bargained for. The rain finally stopped around midnight, and I could see stars appearing between the clouds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight I allowed myself to hope that sometimes David really could beat Goliath, especially when David had right on his side. The Seattle courthouse steps were slippery from the morning drizzle as Janet and I made our way to the filing clerk's office. In my hands was our formal response to Blackstone's eviction lawsuit, 37 pages of legal arguments that represented our best shot at survival. Remember, Miguel, Janet said as we waited in line, once we file this, there's no turning back. Blackstone will come at us with everything they have. I nodded, watching the steady stream of lawyers, defendants, and court officials moving through the marble halls. Some looked confident, others defeated. I wondered which category I'd fall into when this was all over. The filing fee alone was $400 money I couldn't really afford, but Janet insisted we needed to look professional. Perception matters in court, she'd explained. We can't give them any reason to see us as amateur or unprepared. As we walked back to the parking garage, my phone rang. It was Carlos, my sous chef. Miguel, I need to tell you something. A man in an expensive suit came by the restaurant this morning, asking questions about you. Rosa told him to leave, but he left his card with one of our customers. My blood ran cold. What kind of questions? About your finances, your family, whether you have any criminal history. Miguel, I think they're investigating you. After hanging up, Janet and I sat in her Honda in the courthouse parking garage while she explained what was likely happening. It's called opposition research. Big corporations hire private investigators to dig up dirt on people they're fighting in court. They're looking for anything they can use to discredit you: tax problems, permit violations, disgruntled former employees. But I don't have any of those things. I've run a clean business. That's good, but they don't know that yet. They're fishing, hoping to find something that will make you want to settle rather than risk having your reputation destroyed. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Janet and I met every evening after the restaurant closed, going over every document related to my lease, my business licenses, my financial records. She was building our case methodically, like constructing a wall brick by brick. The key is your grandfather's original lease agreement, she explained, spreading the yellowed documents across my office table. See this clause here. In the event of property development requiring tenant relocation, landlord shall provide comparable commercial space within 5 miles at equivalent rental terms. Blackstone signed off on assuming all existing lease obligations when they bought the building. So they have to find me another location? Not just any location, one that's truly comparable in terms of foot traffic, accessibility, and commercial viability. In this area, that would be worth easily $2.5 million in setup costs, plus ongoing rental subsidies. It's actually more expensive for them than your buyout demand. But Blackstone's lawyers weren't sitting idle. 3 days after we filed our response, they escalated dramatically. I was prepping vegetables in the kitchen when Rosa burst through the doors, her face flushed with anger. Miguel, there's a health inspector here and she's being really aggressive about everything. She's taking photos, asking about our pest control records, questioning our food storage procedures. The inspector, a stern woman named Patricia Hoffman, spent 4 hours going through every inch of Santos' kitchen with a fine-tooth comb. She found minor violations that had never been issues before: a loose door seal on one refrigerator, a hand-washing station that was 6 inches closer to the prep area than current regulations required. These violations need to be corrected within 48 hours, or we'll have to consider closure pending re-inspection, she announced, handing me a citation. After she left, Janet arrived to help me understand what was happening. This is coordinated harassment, she said bluntly. Blackstone has connections in city government, and they're using every regulatory tool they can find to pressure you. The repairs cost $3,200 money I had to borrow from my business credit line. But worse than the financial hit was the psychological warfare. Every day brought a new challenge: a surprise fire department inspection, questions from the business licensing department about my permit renewals, even a visit from immigration officials asking about my employees' documentation. They're trying to exhaust you financially and emotionally, Janet explained. Most small business owners would have given up by now. The stress was showing on my staff. Carlos had dark circles under his eyes from worrying about the immigration visit. Linda seemed jumpy every time someone official-looking entered the restaurant. Even Rosa, usually unflappable, was snapping at suppliers and customers. But something unexpected started happening. The more pressure Blackstone applied, the more support we received from the community. Mrs. Patterson, my regular customer battling cancer, organized a letter-writing campaign to the city council. This restaurant isn't just a business, she wrote in the Seattle Times. It's a community anchor where people from all backgrounds come together. Miguel Santos represents everything we claim to value about small business and immigrant success stories. Tommy, the homeless veteran I'd been feeding for 2 years, started showing up every morning to sweep our sidewalk and help with small maintenance tasks. You never asked me for anything, Miguel. Now it's my turn to help you. Local food bloggers began featuring Santos' kitchen prominently, and our weekend reservations actually increased. People wanted to support us, to be part of the fight against corporate bullying. The most surprising support came from other restaurant owners who'd faced similar battles. Maria Gonzalez, who owned a successful bakery in Capitol Hill, stopped by one evening with a check for $2,000. 5 years ago, a big hotel chain tried to push me out of my location. I didn't have the courage to fight them, and I still regret it. This is for your legal fund, and don't you dare give up. These gestures of solidarity kept me going through the darkest moments, but they couldn't change the fundamental mathematics of the situation. My legal bills were mounting faster than my revenue, and Blackstone showed no signs of backing down. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Jerry Walsh, my accountant. Miguel, I've been looking at Blackstone's corporate filings and something doesn't add up, he said during one of our evening meetings. They're claiming this development is for residential condos, but their permit applications show commercial space on the ground floor. If they're planning retail or restaurant space, your lease clause becomes even stronger. Janet's eyes lit up. If they're planning to put their own restaurant in that space, they're not just violating your lease, they're engaging in anti-competitive business practices. We need to investigate this immediately. I hired a private investigator of our own, a former Seattle police detective named Barbara Chen who specialized in corporate fraud cases. Within a week, she'd uncovered something remarkable. Blackstone isn't just developing condos, she reported. They're partnering with a national restaurant chain to put a flagship location on your ground floor. The lease agreement is already signed, and construction permits show they're planning a 200-seat restaurant with full bar service. This changed everything. Blackstone wasn't just trying to develop property, they were eliminating competition for their own restaurant venture. Our case had transformed from a simple lease dispute to a potential antitrust violation. But Blackstone's lawyers weren't finished with their intimidation campaign. The final escalation came on a Thursday morning when I arrived at the restaurant to find official notices posted on our windows. Property condemned, immediate evacuation required. My hands shook as I read the city engineer's report claiming structural deficiencies requiring immediate assessment. The building I'd worked in for 8 years was supposedly unsafe, and we had 24 hours to vacate. Janet arrived within an hour, her face grim as she photographed the notices. This is their nuclear option. They're using their political connections to force you out through condemnation proceedings. Can they do that? Legally, yes, if the building really is unsafe. But the timing is suspicious. This building passed a structural inspection just 6 months ago when Blackstone bought it. We hired an independent structural engineer who confirmed what I suspected. The building was perfectly safe. The city's report was based on a preliminary assessment that had been rushed through without proper investigation. Someone with influence pushed this through the bureaucracy faster than normal procedures allow, Janet explained. We can fight it, but the appeals process takes months. By then you'll be bankrupt from lost revenue. That night, I sat in my empty restaurant, surrounded by tables and chairs I might never use again. 8 years of building relationships with customers, perfecting recipes, creating jobs for my employees, all of it threatened by corporate lawyers who saw my life's work as nothing more than an obstacle to their profit margins. But as I looked around the dining room, I realized something had changed in me during these weeks of fighting. I was no longer the scared small business owner who'd received that first eviction notice. The community support, the evidence we'd gathered, and Janet's unwavering belief in our case had transformed my fear into determination. Blackstone had made a critical mistake in their campaign of intimidation. They'd assumed I would react like most small business owners, fold under pressure and take whatever deal they offered. Instead, they'd given me a graduate education in corporate hardball tactics and inadvertently provided evidence of their own misconduct. Tomorrow we would file for an emergency injunction to stop the condemnation proceedings. We'd present our evidence of Blackstone's anti-competitive behavior and their misuse of city regulatory processes. It was our last chance to stay in business, but it was also our best chance to win. As I locked up Santos Kitchen for what might be the last time, I thought about my grandfather's courage in coming to America with nothing but hopes and dreams. He'd faced bigger challenges than corporate lawyers and corrupt bureaucrats. If he could build something meaningful from nothing, I could find a way to protect what he'd started. The rain had started again, pattering against the windows like applause from an unseen audience. Tomorrow would bring the fight of my life, but tonight I allowed myself to believe that sometimes the good guys really do win, especially when they refuse to give up. The emergency hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Monday morning, and I barely slept the weekend before. Janet had filed our injunction request along with a binder of evidence documenting Blackstone's campaign of harassment and their undisclosed restaurant partnership. "Remember, Miguel," she coached me as we sat outside the courtroom, "Judge Williams has a reputation for being thorough and fair, but she doesn't tolerate games from either side. We need to present our facts clearly and let the evidence speak for itself." Judge Sarah Williams was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd built her career prosecuting white-collar crime before being appointed to the bench. Her courtroom was known for efficiency and fairness, exactly what we needed. Blackstone's legal team was impossible to miss. 5 attorneys in identical dark suits, led by a man Janet identified as Harrison Blake, a partner at Morrison, Fitzgerald and Associates, one of Seattle's most prestigious corporate law firms. Blake looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine ad for expensive watches, perfectly groomed gray hair, Italian leather shoes, and an air of absolute confidence that comes from rarely losing. As we took our seats, he glanced at me with the expression someone might give an annoying insect. "Your Honor," Blake began when proceedings started, "this is a simple matter of property development law. Mr. Santos is attempting to use frivolous legal challenges to extort additional compensation beyond our generous settlement offer. The city's condemnation order is based on legitimate safety concerns. Judge Williams looked unimpressed. Mr. Blake, I've reviewed the city engineer's report. It seems unusually expedited. Can you explain why this building was deemed safe 6 months ago but suddenly requires immediate evacuation? Blake's confidence flickered slightly. The previous inspection may not have been as thorough as current standards require, Your Honor. Janet stood to respond. Your Honor, we have evidence that the city's report was rushed through proper channels at the request of someone with significant political influence. We also have documentation showing that Blackstone Properties has already signed a lease agreement with Chef Corp International to place a flagship restaurant in the ground floor space currently occupied by my client. The judge's eyebrows rose. Is this true, Mr. Blake? Any future commercial development is separate from the current lease dispute, Blake replied, but his voice had lost some of its earlier authority. Not when it demonstrates anti-competitive behavior designed to eliminate an existing business, Janet countered. We'd like to present our evidence to the court. What followed was 3 hours of detailed testimony about Blackstone's tactics. Barbara Chen, our private investigator, presented a timeline showing how each regulatory challenge against Santos Kitchen had been initiated within 48 hours of meetings between Blackstone executives and city officials. The structural engineer testified that the building was not only safe but in better condition than many comparable properties in the area. The condemnation report appears to be based on photographs rather than actual structural assessment, he explained. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. During the lunch recess, Janet received a call from someone who wouldn't identify themselves but claimed to have information we needed. There's a document in the city planning office that you should see, the anonymous caller said. Filed under permit application BP 2024-7739. Barbara Chen rushed to City Hall and returned with a smoking gun. Chef Corp's detailed restaurant plans for our location, filed 3 weeks before Blackstone had made their first buyout offer to me. The plans showed a full kitchen renovation, expanded dining space, and a bar area that would directly compete with every aspect of Santos Kitchen's business. When we reconvened, Janet presented this evidence to a courtroom that had grown noticeably tenser. Your Honor, this proves that Blackstone Properties never intended to negotiate in good faith with my client. They had already decided to replace his business with a competitor before they even approached him about selling. Judge Williams studied the documents carefully. Mr. Blake, how do you explain your client filing detailed restaurant renovation plans before beginning lease termination proceedings with the current tenant? Blake conferred hurriedly with his team before responding. Those were preliminary development studies, Your Honor. No final decisions had been made. Preliminary studies don't typically include signed lease agreements and construction timelines, the judge observed dryly. The afternoon session focused on the specific language in my grandfather's lease agreement. Janet walked the judge through each clause, explaining how Blackstone had assumed all lease obligations when they purchased the building. The requirement to provide comparable commercial space isn't just about square footage, Janet argued. It's about maintaining the viability of the existing business. In this location with this foot traffic and customer base, Mr. Santos has built something that can't simply be relocated to a strip mall in the suburbs. Blake tried to argue that the lease clause was outdated and unenforceable, but Judge Williams seemed skeptical. Mr. Blake, when your client purchased this property, did they not perform due diligence on existing lease obligations? Of course, Your Honor, but... And did those lease obligations include this clause requiring comparable space in case of development? Yes, but the clause is ambiguous about what constitutes comparable. Judge Williams cut him off. The clause seems quite specific to me. Comparable commercial space within 5 miles at equivalent rental terms. What part of that language is ambiguous? By 4 p.m., Blake's team looked like they'd been through a battle. Their confident swagger had been replaced by hurried conferences and whispered consultations. I could see them texting frantically, probably updating Blackstone executives about how badly the hearing was going. But Blake had one final card to play. Your Honor, even if we accept Mr. Santos's interpretation of his lease agreement, the fundamental issue remains. This building has been condemned by city engineers as unsafe. We cannot be required to provide alternative space for a business that is operating in violation of safety codes. This was their strongest argument and I felt my stomach drop. If the condemnation order stood, it wouldn't matter what my lease said, I'd be shut down regardless. Janet was ready for this challenge. Your Honor, We believe the condemnation order was issued improperly, based on political pressure rather than genuine safety concerns. We've prepared evidence showing a pattern of regulatory harassment coordinated with Blackstone's legal strategy. She presented phone records showing multiple calls between Blackstone executives and city officials in the days leading up to each regulatory challenge. Email timestamps proving that inspection schedules were shared with Blackstone before I was notified. Financial records showing that Blackstone had made significant campaign contributions to city council members who had influence over the building department. Judge Williams looked increasingly troubled as the evidence mounted. "Mr. Blake, are you prepared to respond to these allegations of improper coordination between your client and city regulators?" Blake's composure finally cracked. "Your Honor, these are serious accusations without foundation. My client has every right to engage with city officials about development projects, but not to coordinate harassment of existing tenants or to influence the timing of safety inspections for competitive advantage." The hearing concluded at 5:30 p.m. with Judge Williams announcing that she would issue her ruling within 48 hours. As Blake and his team packed their expensive briefcases, I could see the concern in their faces. They'd walked into court expecting to crush a small restaurant owner, but instead found themselves defending against evidence of corporate misconduct and regulatory corruption. That evening, Janet and I had dinner at Santos Kitchen, possibly one of the last meals I'd serve there, depending on the judge's decision. Rosa had prepared a special menu featuring all of my grandmother's recipes, and several regular customers stopped by to offer encouragement. Mrs. Patterson brought flowers from her garden. "Miguel, whatever happens in court, you've already won something important. You've shown this community what it means to fight for what's right." Tommy, the veteran, cleaned tables without being asked and helped Carlos with prep work for the next day. "This place saved my life, Miguel. Now we're all trying to save it for you." Around 9 p.m. as we were closing for the night, a black sedan pulled up outside, the same type I'd been noticing for weeks. A man in an expensive suit got out and approached our door. My heart rate spiked, thinking it might be another intimidation attempt. Instead, it was Richard Blackwood himself, the Blackstone Properties executive who'd been texting me throughout the legal battle. "Mr. Santos, I think we should talk." I let him in, curious about what Blackstone's president wanted to say in person. Blackwood was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40 years old, with the kind of casual confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. "I'll be direct," he said, sitting across from me in one of our dining room booths. "Today didn't go well for us in court. My lawyers are telling me we might lose, which would be expensive. More expensive than trying to destroy my business?" He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "That wasn't the plan initially. We offered you a fair buyout, and when you refused, things escalated beyond what I intended. So you're here to make another offer? I'm here to understand why you won't take yes for an answer. We're offering you more money than this place will make in 10 years. You could retire, move somewhere warm, never worry about health inspectors or city permits again." I looked around the dining room where I'd celebrated birthdays with customers, where Rosa's children had done homework after school, where Tommy had found dignity and purpose when the rest of the world had written him off. "Mr. Blackwood, how much money would it take for you to sell your childhood home?" "That's different. This is a business." "No, it's not different. This restaurant is my family's legacy, my employees' livelihood, and my community's gathering place. You can't put a price on that because it's not for sale." Blackwood left without another word, and I knew the battle lines were now clearly drawn. Tomorrow, Judge Williams would decide whether justice belonged to the corporation with unlimited resources or the small business owner fighting for his life's work. As I locked up for the night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine optimism. We'd presented our case honestly and thoroughly. We'd exposed Blackstone's misconduct and proven the validity of our legal arguments. Now it was in the hands of a judge who seemed to understand what was really at stake. The rain had finally stopped, and for the first time in weeks, I could see stars above the Seattle skyline. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or defeat, but tonight I knew I'd given everything I had to the fight. Whatever happened next, I could live with the consequences. I couldn't eat breakfast the morning of the verdict. My stomach was a knot of anxiety as I dressed in my one good suit, the same one I'd worn to my father's funeral and my citizenship ceremony. Some moments demand your best clothes, even when you can't afford them. Janet met me at the courthouse steps at 8:30 a.m., even though Judge Williams wasn't scheduled to announce her decision until 10 a.m. We both needed the extra time to prepare mentally for whatever was coming. "Miguel, I want you to know that regardless of what happens today, you've fought the good fight. You've shown more courage than most people twice your size. The courthouse hallway was more crowded than usual. Word had spread through the local business community about our case, and several small business owners had come to show support. Maria from the bakery was there, along with the owner of the used bookstore, the woman who ran the alterations shop, and even a few customers from Santos Kitchen. Harrison Blake and his team arrived precisely at 9:45 a.m., their confident demeanor intact despite yesterday's difficulties. Blake nodded politely to Janet but didn't acknowledge me at all, a small slight that somehow felt appropriate. In his world, I probably wasn't worth noticing. Judge Williams took the bench at exactly 10 a.m. and surveyed the packed courtroom with mild surprise. It seems this case has attracted quite a bit of community interest. Before I announce my ruling, I want to remind everyone that this is a court of law, not a public forum. I expect appropriate decorum regardless of my decision. She opened a thick folder and began reading from her prepared statement. In the matter of Blackstone Properties versus Santos Kitchen, I have carefully reviewed all evidence and testimony presented by both parties. This case raises important questions about property rights, contract law, and the appropriate use of municipal regulatory authority. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. The defendant's lease agreement, dating to 1987, contains specific language requiring the provision of comparable commercial space in the event of development-related termination. The plaintiff argues this clause is ambiguous or unenforceable. I disagree. Blake shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The language is clear and specific. When Blackstone Properties purchased this building, they assumed all existing lease obligations including this clause. They cannot now claim ignorance of terms they agreed to assume. Janet squeezed my hand under the table. However, the more troubling aspect of this case involves the coordination between the plaintiff and city regulatory agencies to pressure the defendant through administrative channels. The evidence presented suggests a pattern of harassment designed to force business closure through regulatory intimidation. Judge Williams's voice grew stern as she continued. The timing of health inspections, fire department visits, and building condemnation proceedings shows a level of coordination that raises serious questions about the proper use of municipal authority. When regulatory agencies become tools for private business disputes, the integrity of our entire system is compromised. Blake was now conferring urgently with his colleagues, their whispered conversation audible across the courtroom. Most concerning is the evidence that the plaintiff had already negotiated restaurant lease agreements for the defendant's space before initiating termination proceedings. This suggests that elimination of competition, rather than legitimate development needs, was the primary motivation for these legal actions. The judge paused and looked directly at Blake's table. Mr. Blake, I hope you will convey to your client that such tactics reflect poorly on the legal profession and undermine public confidence in fair business practices. Blake's face was flushed with embarrassment and anger. Judge Williams turned back to her prepared statement. Therefore, I am granting the defendant's motion for injunctive relief. The city's condemnation order is hereby stayed pending proper independent structural assessment. More importantly, I am ruling that Blackstone Properties is obligated under the existing lease agreement to provide Mr. Santos with comparable commercial space within the specified geographic area. The courtroom erupted in applause before the judge's gavel restored order. Janet was grinning so widely I thought her face might split in half. Behind me, I could hear Mrs. Patterson crying with relief. But Judge Williams wasn't finished. Furthermore, I am ordering Blackstone Properties to cease all coordination with city regulatory agencies regarding the defendant's business operations. Any future inspections or regulatory actions will be scheduled through proper channels with appropriate notice and due process. Blake stood to respond, but the judge held up her hand. I'm not done, Mr. Blake. Given the pattern of behavior demonstrated in this case, I am referring the matter of regulatory coordination to the State Attorney General's Office for investigation of potential ethics violations. The inappropriate use of municipal authority for private business disputes is a serious matter that requires further scrutiny. Now Blake looked genuinely worried. An ethics investigation could damage both his law firm's reputation and Blackstone's business relationships throughout the state. Finally, Judge Williams concluded, I am awarding the defendant reasonable attorney fees and costs related to defending against what I can only characterize as frivolous and bad faith legal tactics. Mr. Santos should not have been forced to spend his life savings defending his legitimate business interests. The gavel came down with finality, and suddenly everyone was talking at once. Janet was shaking my hand and explaining what would happen next. Community supporters were offering congratulations and hugs. Local reporters were taking notes and photos. Through it all, I sat in stunned silence trying to process what had just happened. We'd won. Not just won, we'd achieved total victory in a way I hadn't dared to hope for. Blake was packing his briefcase with sharp, angry movements. As he prepared to leave, he stopped at our table, his earlier arrogance replaced by barely controlled frustration. This isn't over, Santos. Finding you comparable space will be impossible. We'll tie this up in appeals for years. Judge Williams, who was still on the bench reviewing some paperwork, looked up sharply. Mr. Blake, are you threatening to violate a direct court order? Blake's face went pale. No, Your Honor. I simply meant. You meant that your client intends to comply fully and promptly with this court's ruling. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. Of course. After the legal teams and court officials had left, I found myself standing in the courthouse hallway surrounded by friends, customers, and fellow business owners. The emotional weight of the past months finally hit me, and I had to sit down on one of the marble benches before my legs gave out. Rosa appeared beside me with a cup of coffee from the courthouse cafe. Miguel, we did it. Santos Kitchen is safe. But even in victory, I knew our challenges weren't completely over. Blackstone would have to find me comparable space, but Blake was right about one thing: truly comparable space in our area was almost impossible to find. Most prime commercial locations were already occupied or prohibitively expensive. That afternoon, Janet and I met in her cramped office to discuss the practical implications of our victory. Blackstone has 60 days to present you with at least 3 comparable space options, she explained. If you reasonably reject all 3, they'll have to provide additional options or face contempt of court charges. What happens if they can't find anything genuinely comparable? Then they'll have to pay significant financial penalties and potentially buy out your lease at fair market value, which would be much more expensive than their original settlement offer. Over the next 2 weeks, something remarkable happened. The media attention from our court victory brought Santos Kitchen more customers than we'd ever served. Food bloggers, local TV stations, and even a few national outlets covered our story as an example of small business perseverance against corporate bullying. The Seattle Times ran a feature article titled, "When David Beats Goliath, How One Restaurant Owner Stood Up to Corporate Pressure." The piece highlighted not just our legal victory, but the community support that had sustained us through the darkest months of the battle. Miguel Santos didn't just save his restaurant, the article concluded. He reminded this city what we lose when we let corporate interests steamroll the small businesses that give our neighborhoods their character and soul. The increased visibility brought unexpected opportunities. A local food delivery service waived their fees for 6 months to help us reach new customers. A downtown office building offered us a catering contract for their employee cafeteria. Most surprisingly, the Culinary Institute of Seattle asked if I'd be willing to teach a class on traditional Mexican cooking techniques. But the real vindication came in the form of a phone call from Richard Blackwood 3 weeks after the court ruling. "Mr. Santos, we need to talk. In person if possible." This time, Blackwood came to Santos Kitchen during our quiet afternoon hours, accompanied by a woman he introduced as Patricia Morrison, Blackstone's VP of Development. Both looked significantly less confident than during our previous encounters. "Miguel, may I call you Miguel? We have a problem," Blackwood began, removing his jacket and sitting in one of our booths like a regular customer rather than a corporate adversary. "We've identified 12 potential spaces within the 5-mile radius specified by your lease. Our real estate team has evaluated each one, and honestly, none of them are truly comparable to what you have here." Patricia Morrison opened her laptop and showed me detailed analyses of each location. Strip mall spaces with limited parking. Ground floor retail in residential areas with minimal foot traffic. Former restaurant locations in declining neighborhoods with demographic challenges. "The truth is," Morrison continued, "your location is unique. The foot traffic from Pike Place Market, the tourist visibility, the established customer base we can't replicate that anywhere else in the area." I looked around Santos Kitchen, seeing it through their eyes for the first time. The morning rush of downtown office workers grabbing breakfast before work. The lunch crowd of tourists and locals mixing seamlessly over shared tables. The evening regulars who'd become extended family over the years. "So what are you proposing?" I asked. Blackwood and Morrison exchanged glances before he answered. "We want to buy your lease rights outright, but at a fair market value that reflects what we've learned about your business during this legal process. Our original offer of $2.3 million was based on standard calculations that didn't account for your established customer base, community relationships, or the unique value of this location." Morrison slid a folder across the table. We're prepared to offer $4.2 million for your lease rights and business assets. Additionally, we'd like to discuss a consulting arrangement for you to help design and menu the restaurant space we're planning. Your expertise with authentic Mexican cuisine and community engagement would be valuable to our Chef Corp partnership. I opened the folder and stared at numbers that would change my life completely. Enough money to retire comfortably, travel, maybe open a small place somewhere warm like my mother had suggested. Or enough capital to expand Santos Kitchen into the restaurant empire I'd sometimes dreamed about. But as I looked around the dining room where Tommy was quietly reading a newspaper, where Mrs. Patterson waved from her usual corner table, where Rosa was training a new server with patient encouragement, I realized something important. The money wasn't really the point. The fight had never been about extracting maximum value from Blackstone Properties. It had been about protecting something that couldn't be priced or replace the community we'd built together, the relationships that gave my work meaning, the sense of belonging that both my employees and customers found within these walls. Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate the improved offer, but Santos Kitchen isn't for sale. It never was. His face showed genuine surprise. Miguel, this is more than twice our original offer. You could buy any restaurant location in the city with this money. But I couldn't buy back 8 years of relationships with customers who've become family. I couldn't recreate the trust my employees have in me, or the sense of community that makes this place special. Patricia Morrison leaned forward. Then what do you want from us? The answer had been forming in my mind throughout the legal battle, crystallizing during weeks of community support and media attention. I want you to build your condos without disturbing Santos Kitchen. Integrate us into your development plan as the ground floor commercial anchor. Give your future residents and the surrounding community an authentic neighborhood restaurant instead of another corporate chain. Blackwood and Morrison looked at each other with expressions I couldn't read. That would require completely redesigning our development plans, Morrison said slowly. Yes, it would. But you'd end up with something more valuable than another generic luxury building. You'd create a development that enhances the existing community instead of displacing it. Over the next hour, we discussed possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to consider. Blackstone could build around Santos Kitchen, creating a mixed-use development that preserved what worked while adding modern residential and commercial space. The legal requirement for comparable space could be satisfied by expanding our current location with additional dining areas and improved kitchen facilities. It would be more expensive than our original plan, Blackwood admitted. But after this legal battle, and especially after the ethics investigation the judge initiated, we need to rebuild our reputation in this community. A development that preserves a beloved local business while creating new opportunities might be exactly the kind of positive story we need. They left that afternoon without a final agreement, but with a commitment to explore the possibility seriously. Both Blackstone's architects and their financial team would need to evaluate whether my proposal was feasible given their existing commitments and profit requirements. 3 days later, Patricia Morrison called with an answer. Miguel, it won't be easy and it won't be cheap, but we think we can make your vision work. Our architects believe they can design a development that incorporates and expands Santos Kitchen while still meeting our residential and commercial objectives. Would you be willing to discuss terms? The negotiations took another month, involving lawyers, architects, city planners, and financial analysts. But the final agreement exceeded even my optimistic hopes. Blackstone would construct their luxury condos on the upper floors while expanding Santos Kitchen to include a full bar, private dining room, and outdoor terrace. They'd handle all construction costs and provide a 20-year lease at current rental rates, with options for renewal. More importantly, the agreement included provisions for maintaining Santos Kitchen's character and community focus. I'd have final approval over any design changes affecting the restaurant's atmosphere. Half of our expanded seating would be reserved for walk-in customers rather than reservations, ensuring we remained accessible to our longtime regulars. The construction would be phased to allow Santos Kitchen to remain open throughout most of the development process, with temporary location assistance during the most disruptive phases. On the day we signed the final agreement, I invited everyone who'd supported us through the legal battle to a celebration dinner. The restaurant was packed with customers, employees, fellow business owners, Janet, and even Judge Williams, who stopped by briefly to congratulate us on finding a creative solution. Harrison Blake, notably, was not among Blackstone's representatives at the signing. I learned later that his firm had quietly ended their relationship with Blackstone Properties, and Blake himself was facing disciplinary action from the State Bar Association. As the evening wound down and the last guests left, I found myself alone in Santos Kitchen with Rosa and Carlos, cleaning up after the celebration. "Miguel," Rosa said as she wiped down tables, "do you ever regret not taking their money and walking away? You could have been sitting on a beach somewhere instead of fighting corporations and construction delays." I looked around the dining room where we'd celebrated victories and weathered storms together. The walls still held the same photos and thank you cards, but now they'd be joined by new memories in an expanded space designed to serve our community for decades to come. "Rosa, my grandfather came to this country with nothing but hopes and determination. He worked construction jobs and saved every penny to eventually open a small market. My father built on that foundation to create opportunities for his family. This restaurant isn't just my business, it's the latest chapter in a story that started with people who refused to give up on their dreams." Carlos nodded thoughtfully. "So we're not just serving food. We're continuing something bigger." "Exactly. And sometimes that's worth fighting for, even when everyone tells you to take the money and run." 6 months later, construction began on what local media dubbed the Santos Building, a mixed-use development that preserved the heart of our neighborhood while adding modern residential and commercial space. The construction was disruptive and occasionally frustrating, but every day brought us closer to a future that honored our past while embracing new possibilities. The expanded Santos Kitchen opened 18 months later to a line of customers that stretched around the block. The new space accommodated twice as many diners while maintaining the intimate atmosphere that had made us special. The rooftop terrace provided stunning views of Elliott Bay, and the private dining room hosted wedding celebrations, business meetings, and community events. But the best part was seeing familiar faces in the crowd. Mrs. Patterson, now in remission from her cancer, hosted her family's celebration dinner in our new private dining room. Tommy, who'd been hired as our full-time maintenance coordinator, greeted customers at the door with pride and genuine warmth. Rosa had been promoted to general manager, overseeing a staff of 22 employees. On opening night, I received a handwritten note from Judge Williams. "Mr. Santos, you've proven that sometimes the best legal victory is finding a solution that benefits everyone involved. Your community is lucky to have someone willing to fight for what matters." Looking back on that terrifying eviction notice I'd received 2 years earlier, I realized that Blackstone Properties inadvertently gave me the greatest gift possible. They forced me to discover how much Santos Kitchen really meant to our community and how far people would go to protect something they valued. The lawyer who'd laughed at me in court, predicting I'd lose everything, had been spectacularly wrong. Instead of losing everything, I'd gained a deeper understanding of what I was really fighting for. The struggle had transformed a small neighborhood restaurant into a symbol of community resilience and the power of refusing to give up on what matters most. Some fights are worth having not because victory is guaranteed, but because the act of fighting reveals who you really are and what you're willing to stand for. In the end, that's a lesson worth more than any settlement check Blackstone Properties could have offered.